Hello, everyone, and welcome. We'll give it another minute or so just to allow everyone to hop on and join us today. Okay, looks like we have a great group, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Hello and welcome everyone to Critical Path Institute's Rare and Orphan Disease Program Professional Development Webinar Series. My name is Dominique Cruz and I'm the project manager for RDCA DAP, the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator Data and Analytics Platform. RDCA DAP provides a centralized and standardized infrastructure to support and speed up rare disease characterization with the goal of accelerating therapy development for rare diseases. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's webinar, New Findings on Inequities in Rare Diseases, How They Impact Research and Clinical Trial Processes. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions throughout the presentation for our speakers, please put them in the Q&A box. The chat function is disabled for everyone, just so we can make sure we aren't missing any questions that pop up throughout the presentation. And all participant lines are muted so we can reduce background noise. We are recording this presentation and it will be available on demand viewing on our YouTube channel about an hour after the webinar. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker. Jenifer Waldrop joined the Black Women's Health Imperative as Executive Director of the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition in October of 2022. She volunteers as the Professional Development Director of the National Association of Asian American Professionals of Colorado. Through this organization, she mentors formally and informally. Now I'm glad to kick it off and hand it off to Jenifer, who will continue on with our webinar today.
Thank you, Dominique. Thank you, CPATH, for inviting myself, RDDC, the Black Women's Health Imperative, to be a part of your webinar series. We're really grateful to be able to spend this time with you today to share one of our newest studies, as mentioned, Inequities in the Rare Disease Community. As you see here on the slide, that is the cover of our report. This report was collaborated with the National Organization for Rare Disorders, otherwise known as NORD. And we released this report in August, specifically August 27th. This report can be found on the Rare Disease website, which is listed over here. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition is a part of the Black Women's Health Imperative. The coalition began in May of 2020. We are one of many programs within the Black Women's Health Imperative. The Black Women's Health Imperative, known as BWHI, has been around for 41 years, a little bit younger than NORD, I found out the other day. NORD has a 41-year anniversary in the springtime, and BWHI has their anniversary in the fall. The purpose of this coalition is to bring together rare disease experts, health and diversity advocates, and industry leaders. We use this body of knowledge to identify and advocate for evidence-based solutions to alleviate the disproportionate burdens of rare diseases on historically marginalized populations, as stated on the slide. The purpose of the coalition really differentiates itself from other organizations like NORD because we are hyper-focused on the health equity area. And we're really here to bring a number of these groups together so that health equity, it becomes not another topic, but really in the forefront of the information that we do and everything that we do. Next slide, please. As I mentioned here, here's a little bit of the overview, which I won't read, but the vision for the group is, of course, a world with out health disparities in rare disease patient communities. So it's a very lofty goal, but we can only do that with the help of our coalition members. And there's a sample here on the right. We're almost at 100 coalition members. We are made up of, as you can see here, government entities, other patient advocacy organizations, hospitals and healthcare systems, biotech and pharma companies. So when you think about the patients, think about their holistic perspective and the different components that they need. We invite all coalition folks, anybody that's interested, to participate as a member, because together we can help the rare disease community. Our mission, as stated here on the left side, is dedicated to addressing the extraordinary challenges faced by historically underrepresented rare disease patients that are encompassed by social determinants of health. I think that's something that's important for us to note for today's conversation, because when we look at the inequities in our community, we've identified specific tenets and components of social determinants of health. And then when we look at the RDDC goal, like other teams and other organizations, we have our goals here. Our goals is to support the stakeholders with their efforts within the rare community. So I really put forward first the coalition members and other key stakeholders within the rare community and supporting their goals, as I mentioned, bringing forward the health equity component. And then, of course, we want to implement a systemic change to improve the experiences for the underserved patients with rare diseases. And that means really that we're looking for not just to do a Band-Aid and to put programs together, but really to look at the systems that impact the rare disease patients and how can we improve upon them. Next slide, please. So when you think about rare disease patients, and many of you in the CPATH communities are no strangers to this area, there are lots of barriers. As a rare disease patient, you might feel isolated, as shown on that road up here. You may feel like there's a stigma, especially in certain populations. If you're ever sick, there's a huge stigma around that. Did you know that out of the 10,000 rare diseases, there's only 5% that the FDA has approved for treatment? So therefore, 95% lack a true treatment plan. We've got scattered populations. There's over 30 million Americans with one rare disease, if not more, but they're scattered throughout. And so there is obviously that feeling of isolation that can come with that if you don't know somebody or you can relate to somebody that has a rare disease. But there are over 30 million Americans with rare diseases, so it really isn't that rare. Unfortunately, there's scarce expertise and information out there. It is very challenging for providers and other educators to truly have the deep knowledge of all 10,000 rare diseases. So the information is somewhat scarce. And because of all of this and other factors, there is a delay in diagnosis. The average rare disease patient takes about 5 to 7 years to actually get their diagnosis. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that with a special guest that's in today's webinar as well, besides myself. And the delays in diagnosis can also be the number of providers and others that are seeing you. And the definition of providers is more than just your clinician and just your healthcare main provider as well. So the definition is very extensive when it comes to the provider categories. But you can see about 5 to 7 providers too before actually being diagnosed. And there's a handful of folks that actually are undiagnosed and they consider themselves of having a rare disease. The actual numbers actually go up even higher when you talk about the patients that are from the underserved communities. So their delay in diagnosis can extend by a couple more years. So if you think of a child, when it is born, obviously it's about 0 or 1 day old. It may take them 9 years, for example, to be diagnosed. Some people may not be diagnosed until they're adults. So imagine living with a rare disease for at least 9 years, as an example in this case. That's a really long time, and you can physically see what a 9-year-old child looks like. So these rare disease barriers within our own healthcare systems currently are not set up to properly diagnose and care for rare diseases, and meaning properly quicker diagnosis, getting care, and all these things that you see on the roadway on the right. And then within the rare communities, there are environments and socioeconomic factors that have a significant impact on healthcare outcomes. Meaning that if you have a delay in diagnosis, which means that you aren't getting the treatment as soon as you feel these symptoms, for example, then that can take a real toll on your body as the disease continues to progress. It can also be very expensive. And so there's a number of different factors when there is the delay in diagnosis here. And obviously, the sooner you can identify the disease and you can help treat the disease, and hopefully you can either eradicate the disease in the body, or you can obviously mitigate and minimize the symptoms. And that obviously impacts the quality of life. Next slide, please. So hopefully that gives you a little insights into some of the situations for rare disease patients if you aren't familiar with their lived experiences. So we're here to talk a little bit about this report, and to get to that report, we had to do a survey. The Rare Disease Diversity Coalition is made up of 3 working groups. One of the working groups is the Patient Provider Caregiver Journey Working Group. It is a long name, but it truly, all of those groups impact the diagnosis and the delays in diagnosis for the rare disease patients. This group, through the lens of the work stream of the patient and caregiver, looked at the opportunity out there in terms of evidence base, if there was enough information around rare disease patients, their caregivers, and specifically the underrepresented populations. And we talked to some of our patient coalition members, and we recognized that there's not a lot of evidence-based information out there. So why doesn't RDDC and the working group put together a survey? So they kind of got together and looked at the survey. They looked at the objective and decided what kind of questions they might want to have from these from the survey, and they came up with these 3 objectives. They wanted to listen and learn from the underrepresented communities. They wanted to better understand the experiences of individuals living with rare diseases and investigate whether differences are observed across populations. And they wanted to talk a little bit about and learn from the lived experiences about the barriers to diagnosis, care, and treatment access. So with these 3 objectives set, they had to come up with the questions. Before we came up with the questions, though, we wanted to also ensure that we were doing this in a very inclusive way, using the budget that we have for this survey, both to create it as well as to disseminate it. And the goal here was to do it in English and to do it in Spanish. And we knew that we were going to analyze the data. So in order for us to best analyze the data in English and Spanish, it had to be as if it was one type of collected respondents, as opposed to perhaps because everyone on the working group speaks English, we weren't going to treat Spanish as an other. So we really made sure that the information and the survey tools that we were using would integrate so that the Spanish information would be just as seamless as the English information. And that's what you're seeing here, that as we were creating images and promotions, we made sure that we did it both in English and Spanish. Next slide, please. So if you're thinking about what is the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition and what do they mean about diversity, our definition of diversity and the underserved communities are these 5 categories. The BIPOC, if you're not familiar with that term, is the Black, Indigenous populations and persons of color in that category. The Hispanic ethnicity group, the LGBTQ+, which stands for the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, or other self-reported terms used to indicate the LGBTQ+ status. And then we also looked at the federal poverty level, as well as the rural residents. So as we were collecting the demographic survey, we wanted to make sure that we were able to get these different categories out there and people can voluntarily self-select in these groups. Next slide, please. So once we've identified the objective and we knew what kind of groups that we were going to target, we wanted to ensure that the survey development process included as many partners as possible so that the information will land really well within our community that we're trying to serve. So the partners in this survey are included, as mentioned, the Rare Disease Diversity Patients and Caregiver Working Groups, and there are 52 members, and there you can read a little bit about those bullet points over here. We also have within the RDDC staff, with the program manager, the communication manager, and a community outreach advisor, really hyper-focused on this survey. And over at the National Organization for Rare Disorders, again, this is the organization that helped us establish the Orphan Drug Act, which is so much of the backbone of many of the patient advocacy organizations and pharma and biotech, and the whole ecosystem of the rare disease community that NORD was really instrumental in that particular act 41 years ago. So that organization dedicated their survey designer, the director of research, We identified a Spanish translator, tech specialist, marketing designer, and communication director. So as you can see, it takes a village to create the survey development process. So we didn't just do this in a vacuum, just with RDDC, for example, or a few folks. Next slide, please. So as we're developing the survey process, we, like any other group as project management, we had to figure out how long this was going to take and to be very realistic so that everyone could manage their resources. We had to identify the type of survey instrument that we were going to use. We, of course, had to draft up the questions that we were going to collect and any of the concerns of the targeted populations. Remember, our goal was to hear from the underserved populations. We wanted to deep dive into the overarching topics and an opportunity that the work group members have indicated. Again, like I said, we wanted to do it both in English as well as in Spanish. We had to test the survey in both languages and to ensure that the survey instruments and the information that we were communicating were culturally relevant. And so we went ahead and also had a beta test of groups to help us with this. Next slide, please. So as you're thinking about your clinical trials research work, for those that do that type of work, it's really important to recognize that, it's similar in similar ways. This is also research. And so hopefully you see some parallels in our process in the way that you all do the work too. And you can also see that it does take some time. So even before the survey is launched, it took us at least 6 months to get to identify all the components to get the survey out there, including the questions. So, our data collection was the first of its kind national survey. We used SurveyMonkey, and we launched it in February of 2023, and we collected it for 6 months. Again, it's in English and Spanish. We collected the data anonymously, and I think that's really important because we wanted to be sure that the information that we were getting, people felt the most comfortable that they could answering the questions. Along with, we didn't have obviously any kind of incentives for folks to participate in the survey. You can't do it if it's anonymous as well, right? So all the information that we collected was anonymous and there was no incentives there. And then as you can see here, the topics that were covered was gathering some of the demographics, understanding the rare disease attributes, really understanding the diagnostic journey, going through and finding out a little bit more about health insurance. So this was a US-based survey, healthcare utilization, healthcare experiences, and emotional and health as well was really important for these topics. And then as you can see on the right-hand side here, the inclusion criteria, there are individuals with rare disease, individuals currently diagnosed, but suspect to have a rare disease, current and former caregivers of individuals with or suspected to have a rare disease. So we really honed in on a variety of opportunities in the rare disease community as a part of this inclusion criteria. Next slide, please. So we've now moved from creating the survey itself and getting ready to disseminate and market it. So we created our own website called the RareDiseaseDiversitySurvey.org. So we dedicated a website and we started to make marketing materials here. So here's an example of one of the posters that we created. You could probably see and remember from an image earlier I shared with you in Spanish that there's a very similar theme. So we chose these types of images for the survey. So we're going to go into the marketing materials and to share a little bit more about dissemination and communication plan. Next slide, please. So how did we do? All of our messaging was in English and in Spanish. We surveyed it in both languages. We used our distribution both within the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition community, so our working groups and other stakeholders, and the National Organization for Rare Disorders. And so we were able to reach tens of thousands of folks. We definitely put this information in front of ethnic-based advocacy organizations. So we have a few that are specifically that do the Spanish work. We have folks that are in the Asian American communities. We have folks that are a part of the Muslim population. So we were looking at a number of different types of advocacy groups that we have partners with to get this information. So we're really grateful that we had this breadth of partnership. The postcard promotions here were at, as you can imagine, different conferences, at health fairs. We really tapped into our network. We literally sent out, like Nord acted like a mailing center and sent out these postcards that you saw earlier to folks that had volunteered to pass out this information. and we promoted it on social media, of course, and we actually paid for Google Ads. So as you can see here, the map of the United States, we were able to collect information from all of these different states. As you can see, we did not hit Alaska and Hawaii, for example, but we did hit quite a few within the mainland. Next slide, please. Again, this slide is just showing a little bit about where we were. We created those postcards, both in English and in Spanish on the left-hand side. We leveraged our relationships with the different publications. If you're not familiar with Rare Revolution, it is a magazine dedicated to the rare disease topic, and they're based out of the UK. And then on the right-hand side is an example of a conference or a health fair that Nord attended. Next slide, please. So how do we do? Well, just from the distribution plan, and I want you to note these numbers, look how many people and how many times we reach these big numbers. 405,436 times per the first bullet there. The announcement emails, as I said, went to tens of thousands of people, specifically to over 33,000. And we were able to track click-through rates, as you can see up here, 15,000. So half of those folks actually opened the emails. And then when they actually click through, it was about 10% as a click-through rate there. And the newsletters were specifically sent out. Oh, I'm sorry, the information was specifically sent out within our e-newsletter. So both Nord and RDDC has newsletters. And by the way, if you're interested in joining our newsletter, just go to our website and look on that. And then we can also see how many times people opened the newsletter as well. And then you can also see the distribution channels at the last bullet point on the social media campaign. So tens and hundreds of thousands of information going out there. So hold that number in your head and let's keep going. So as I mentioned, we did this over 6 months. We actually had a goal of trying to hit about 2,000 folks to respond, and we hit that in March. But when we looked at the actual underrepresented populations, we were not hitting our goal of 50% or so. So we kept the recruiting going for a few more months so that we could actually hit something closer to 50%. And so it actually made us extend the time period of this for another 6 months. So don't forget, we did a 6 months planning process, and now we've got a 6 months recruiting process. So just wanted to share the slide with you that it did take a little bit longer than we anticipated. We had to over-index for our respondents in order for us to get the underserved population into this data set. Next slide, please. Drum roll, please. So I asked you to remember that number of hundreds of thousands and tens of thousands of communications and click-throughs because this is where we landed. We actually were able to receive over 2,800 total respondents. The individuals with living rare disease, we had about 78%. And then for caregivers, we had about 22%. And I think that's really important because within the rare disease community, 50% of rare disease patients are children. And so we wanted to be sure that we understood some of that experiences and the caregivers' experiences. So this caregiver number, it could be a parent, but it could also be a spouse, a best friend, etc. Next slide, please. All right, so underrepresented populations. So again, breakthrough survey where we really had a target to try and hit about 50%. For unique individuals, we did that. So when we look at folks that self-identified as an underrepresented population, we looked at these 5 categories, which, as you saw, remember from the earlier slide, the 5 different categories. Now, if you add up those numbers, it would be about 70%, but that's because somebody could be a part of more than one of these different demographics. And so when we pull out their respondent ID number, for example, we actually identified that of these 5 different categories, even if you were a part of all 5 categories, you were only categorized once as we identify you as a unique individual in the underrepresented respondents. So hopefully that makes sense. And if you want to use yourself as an example, if you identify with all 5 groups, we would only count you once in this unique individual category of 1,259 folks. Next slide, please. So then you saw earlier that we had some particular topics that we were trying to cover, and then we were diving deeper, right, into these topics by the respondents and how they answered the questions. and we came up with 14 barriers to care themes. And I mentioned emotional health is one of the areas that we were honing in on. And so specifically, you can look at the anxiety barriers. You can look at different things, maybe immigration status barriers. You can think about it through basic needs barriers. All of that can impact your emotional health. So there are 14 barriers to care themes here, which means there are 14 and more opportunities, right, for us to make a systemic difference for the rare disease community. So as we take the survey to the next level, we are going to keep that in mind and this information that we've collected to help with these barriers to care. Next slide, please. So what does that mean from a data set perspective? We had 14 different barriers to care. So what, right? And so what does that mean in terms of what did you actually see specifically? Well, as you can see here, there's 3 different categories that are bolded. The reason why they're bolded is that these differences were observed specifically in the historically underrepresented populations with a greater delta than the historically represented populations. So from those from the marginalized communities, you are overwhelmed from managing your life, your care, or caregiving responsibilities. That may not be surprising. Think about what happened during during the COVID periods and during COVID-19's when we were all sheltering in place and some of the data that was coming out from there. We had heard the stories of the BIPOC community feeling like they were overwhelmed, much more so than some of their other colleagues that didn't identify as a BIPOC, for example. What about housing instability, food insecurity, and worried about basic needs? 17% of the underrepresented populations are feeling a little that stresses more than the represented populations. And what about being able to fill out the forms and understanding what you're supposed to do? So if you have that opportunity to influence in this space in the healthcare system, whether it's through the clinical trials or others, I highly recommend that you take a look at your forms and see if they're being created in a way that's being understood by all. So I think this is a great opportunity for many of us at the coalition to really drill down in these 3 different categories so that we can help the underrepresented populations. We're going to dive a little deeper into one of these categories. Next slide, please. So that first one at 50% for the historically underrepresented populations, I wasn't kidding about the delta being different. The first bar up top that says that they're not the underserved, so those are the historically represented populations, they're coming out about 40%. That's still a lot that they're overwhelmed with managing their life or caregiving responsibilities. October is LGBTQ History Month. Check out the numbers for that population, over 70%. So the delta between historically represented populations and the LGBTQ community is about 30% difference. That's pretty significant. And so if you have an opportunity or if you want this data, you can come get it from our website and also help us recognize LGBTQ Awareness Month through this lens. And rural population, 50% of the folks feel like this. And next month, it's Rural Health Month, Awareness Month as well. So again, these data sets are not meant to be designed so that's just about the rare disease community. They have that intersection with other communities. And so be sure to note this as you're doing the work that you all do. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. The other component I wanted to call out here is this slide, because this is the impacts of caregiving. So when you think about caregivers, again, as either a parent, a best friend, a spouse, they're impacted by their loved one, essentially. And there's not a whole lot of data out there either on caregivers. So we were very intentional of trying to get that perspective. What you see with the arrows on the left-hand side is that delta of the underrepresented population being fairly larger than the represented respondents here. So when we look at the first one, again, the caregiver perspective, this one's about financial situations. The financial situation has decreased for these caregivers, and it is more so in the underrepresented population than the represented population. That says a lot. And there's a lot of opportunities. So if anyone has that opportunity to work in this space and you need some data to help with your business case on that, please take this information. How about my health is affected by the care situation? As a caregiver, their own health is being impacted by trying to help others. And again, if you look at the delta, the 72% for underrepresented populations and 58% for the represented populations. And then the other category here is the care takes a lot of my own strength. So we can go deeper into the care situation and looking about your own strength. And if you're like me, I'm a lot about energy management and strength. This is really important for myself to show up every day for the work that I do and for my family. By being a caregiver, they volunteer to share that it's been really stressful for them, including their physical strength. And then here's the last one that says, I'm worried about my future because of the care I give. The delta is pretty big. Underrepresented population, 62% and 48% represented. If you're worried about your future, you're going to have some mental health concerns going on over here as well. So you can take that word worry and future and break it up into so many different categories, including going back up to the financial situation. So this is just a little bit of a teaser of the data that we've created so far and that we're able to pull out from this report. But I'm hoping that it's helpful for the way that you think about clinical trials, research, and the work that you all do. Next slide, please. A couple more findings at, again, a first glance from this 2,800 pieces of responders that we've gotten so far. 72% of rare diseases are genetic in origin, but fewer than half of the respondents have received genetic testing. And of those who did not receive testing, 85% were never offered. So if you're so fortunate to have a diagnosis for your rare disease and an accurate one, but you're not being offered for genetic testing, there's a saying out there, and I've met many rare disease patients that they are often identified with more than one rare disease. So the genetic testing could help with identifying future rare diseases in that particular patient. And so out of our data set, there's an opportunity here for us to do better in this space. We talked a little bit about one of the areas for us to look into, which is insurance. And I mentioned that this was US based. Okay. Either way is fine. Within the insurance. And so here's a little more information about the insurance. Most respondents had health insurance, as you saw from the other slide. But there are barriers and there are concerns with their insurance, right? Finding doctors in the network has been a challenge for all of these different groups. Getting referrals to specialists, as you can see here, all respondents, 60% felt this way. Get approvals for procedures, medicines, and food. That's a huge concern. Telehealth, COVID and what have you, has really put telehealth on the map. And so telehealth is a great opportunity for folks to obviously not have to go physically, to travel and what have you to other places. So receiving telehealth is important for many of these respondents from our survey. And then receiving reimbursement for supplemental costs. Interesting to see how both the telehealth and the supplemental costs, the deltas were not that different. Not too different, significantly different between these groups, which says, I think, a lot about just the way our country has handled telehealth and how our country's handling supplemental costs. So if anybody's in the advocacy area and wants to partner with RDDC, we also have an advocacy arm for our work. So feel free to let me know. But I just wanted to share this information with you all because we do have to have health insurance in this country. And we ask the questions in this particular survey. Next slide, please. So I've given you a lot of data in here, and I've given you a lot of just some general information, but I wanted to share the slide with you. And I also wanted to use it a little bit as a teaser for what's coming next, which is we asked them, right, are there any other challenges or barriers that you face within the healthcare system that you would like to share? And I pulled out a couple of different quotes that I was able to identify that I thought you might find interesting for today's conversation. Getting into the drug trials, the new doctors, they don't know about my diseases. We always say the patients are the experts. They know more about the disease than the doctors do. When we think about rural health and the healthcare choices, so many people cannot find their specialists out there. It's probably not surprising for those that are on the call, but it's very painful for the patients. And this is very painful for their real life experiences when they're living in the rural areas. Just being able to afford the cost to live with this disease and all of my medical bills. We talked about financial constraints over there a second ago. So, and people had worry. We saw that about food insecurity. People really are worried about food on the table for their family. We heard that during about the COVID testings and the COVID concerns and sheltering in place. This is still this study was done in 2023, folks. So this is very real still. Not being able to identify with folks that look like me, that are who I am. So not found in Hispanic communities. So there's that sense of isolation, as I mentioned earlier. And then culturally incompetent doctors. That is still a real thing in 2023. The information I learned about cultural competency actually came out of the healthcare system many, many decades ago. And yet we're still sensing that there's culturally incompetent doctors. So again, new data sets. I know many of you guys think that, okay, this has happened before, but now we're drilling down the rare disease community. Next slide, please. So a little bit of the generalization here, and I'm going to queue up for the next part of today's webinar. The multi-stakeholder partnerships and networking and broad recruitment strategies gave us so many of this information, and we're trying to get this back into the community so that they can see that their information actually that we collected landed into this report, and that we have plans to help bridge the gap and the deltas between the diversity and the historically represented, underrepresented populations. We also saw a substantial percentage of survey respondents that reported barriers that led to delays in obtaining healthcare or foregoing healthcare. So that was validating our hypothesis. So we did have a hypothesis going into this survey. And certainly, like I said, this is probably not new news, but it's specific news to the rare disease community. So our next steps is to find ways to address these inequities and improve the barriers to care and access with policy and programming actions. And I would love for us to redo the survey in a few years to look for improvements. So this survey was only made possible, and the information that we got from this from patients. And as you saw, we had many pain points here. And so this webinar, I think, would be really more impactful if I actually brought in a patient to talk a little about his lived experience. We can go to the next slide. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Nate Milam. Nate is a patient, a rare disease patient, and he is going to share his story. He's going to share a little bit about how he had his own delays in diagnosis, despite the fact that he lives pretty close to Washington, D.C. So he is not in a rural community per se, but he did go through his own journey to be able to actually get the diagnosis that he has today. And you all can read a little bit about his background here. But I'm going to turn the mic over to Nate because he's got such a beautiful story that he wants to share with you all. So thank you, everybody, for this opportunity to share about this new report that's out there.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nate, and I would just like to thank Jenifer for this amazing presentation. I think that survey is very important. And I will go into exactly why I think that survey is so important and how I'm just really happy we got so many participants to actually complete it. But again, I'm Nate. I was misdiagnosed with Crohn's disease when I was 7 years old. And I went on to live with that diagnosis for 12 years until I was 19. So the majority of my schooling and growing up, I would say my fundamental years, I spent in and out of the hospital trying to figure out how I was going to survive my Crohn's diagnosis. When I finally was diagnosed correctly with hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis, HLH, I ended up having to have a bone marrow transplant that saved my life, and I went on to graduate college, and I'm allowed to sit in front of you here today. So with that, I am grateful to be an ambassador for the Histiocytosis Association and co-chair of the Patient Advisory Board in partnership with Nacho. I also am working as a Trust and Foundation volunteer with Beacon for Rare Diseases based out of the United Kingdom, which is marking the beginning of my exciting international advocacy journey. And I am also the former RDLA intern and an active member of the RDLA Advisory Committee at Everblack Foundation for Rare Diseases. And thank you. So just a brief overview about histiocytosis, and I can explain our equity and how that intertwines and things like that. But there are 5 different types of histiocytic disorders. So excluding mine, there's 4 others. LCH is probably the most commonly known. Histiocytic disorders are considered orphan diseases because they affect 1 in 200,000 individuals. And And these disorders occur when there is an overproduction of white blood cells known as histiocytes that can lead to organ damage and tumor formation. Everyone can be impacted, and one thing that I would like to point out about this is, in particular for my condition, I had to be transplanted. And according to the National Marrow Donor Program, African Americans have a 23% chance of successfully finding a donor match, which is the lowest of any other ethnic group. And this posed a large challenge for me when I was faced with the decision of whether to be transplanted or not, because I was very sick during the time they discovered my HLH, and the transplantation process was very risky. So I had a 50% chance of surviving. And with that decision, I was also made aware that choosing transplantation meant going through the donation process and finding a donor. And just to brace myself, as that journey would not be very easy. We can go into the next slide, please. So we have a few clinical trials that are currently active for histiocytosis. And one of our main goals is to increase the amount of registrants and people participating. So we have kind of a slim amount of data regarding our ethnicity numbers and our diversity numbers, but from what we could pull, I saw a common trend, and it's that there was a higher level of a higher rate of registrants for not registrants, but higher level of a higher, I'm sorry, give me 1 second while I pull up my notes. Incidence rate. That is what I was looking for. There's a higher incidence rate of histiocytosis found in Caucasians, and there were lower incidence rates found in the Hispanics and African Americans and the BIPOC community. And this is an HLH graph, 2006 to 2019, and we can go on to the next slide. And I know the pictures are kind of blurry. I can explain more on the next slide, but here we have LCH stats. And these are numbers that show similar data, that we have a higher incidence rate in white participants and lowest in Blacks. We have 86% and 5% on the left. And then we have 23%, 45, and then we have 2% on the right. So there's a few reasons why this may be. And one particular reason I think we have limited numbers is because we don't have a lot of outpouring of information to the necessary communities. I think we're lacking in sort of the dissemination of information and the targeting of those who are able to really kind of understand these diseases and get treated for them. Can you go to the next slide, please? And then here's one last graph that shows the same trend. We got non-Hispanics at 85 and Hispanics at 60. So I think that the community outreach needs to be increased. And then we can go to one more slide over. Okay. Oh, sorry, all my Zoom window is. Okay, So we've concluded that white adult patients more commonly have LCH and ECD, and Black adult patients more commonly have RDD. Adult patients who are not white are diagnosed younger than white patients with Histio. White adult patients are more likely to have an identified driver mutation, which in theory gives us more information and a more direct path to targeted therapy. Adult patients who are not white have a longer period of time between their diagnosis and receipt of first treatment. Some preliminary data shows that BIPOC have a longer lag period from symptom onset to diagnosis. Health disparities, access to care, and lack of trust in the system are factors that contribute to this data. And one thing that I wanted to touch on more is the trust in the system aspect. I'm a very passionate person about advocating for equity in healthcare. And I think I'm in a very interesting position when it comes to that because I have both been helped and hurt by the healthcare system. I went through a 12-year period where I was being treated for the wrong thing, during which time I had 13 surgeries in 14 years. I was misdiagnosed 3 different times at 3 different institutions, and I had 3 different ostomy bags, and now I permanently sit with an ostomy bag that I carry with me. However, I did experience these things, but I also received a bone marrow transplant that saved my life, and I get to sit here and advocate for more equity in care. So when having these conversations, I want to highlight the conversation that I had with my barber, because this is a safe space that I feel comfortable sharing my story and using my story to kind of educate the men in the shop about what I've been through and to get their screenings and to get checkups and things like that. And he pointed out to me that he's moved by my story, but he still is finding trouble trusting the system enough to receive care from it. And he spent time talking to me about the Tuskegee syphilis trials. I'm not sure if anyone has it fresh in their mind, so I can just briefly go over it really quickly. The intent of the study was to record the natural history of syphilis in Black people. And it was called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. At the start of the study, there were no proven treatments for the disease, and researchers told the men participating that they were to be treated for bad blood. There were 600 men enrolled, and 399 of them had syphilis, 201 were control subjects. They were enticed to participate with incentives, including medical exams, rides to and from the clinics, meals on examination days, free treatment for minor ailments, and guarantees that provisions will be made after the deaths for their families. There were no proven treatments at the start of the study. Penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis in 1947, but it was withheld from the participants as a part of the treatment for both the experimental group and the control group. And there was a panel formed as there was word that this was unethical. Between the start of the study in 1932 and 1947, dozens of men had died and their wives and children had been infected. So a panel was formed to review the study, and there is evidence that scientific research protocol routinely applied to human subjects was either ignored or deeply flawed to ensure the safety and well-being of the men involved. They were never told about or offered the research procedure called informed consent. They never knew the actual name of the study, the purpose, the potential consequences, or anything like that. And so it was deemed ethically unjustified, and they closed the study. And let's just say, brief overview, you guys can go, you can look it up if you want to. But my barber sat me down and he talks to me about this, and this is why, one of many reasons why he is not comfortable really seeking healthcare. And as someone who has been sick my entire life, I've consistently seen the men in my life also not, they're hesitant to seek treatment. So one of the major problems in these clinical trials that we're having in rare disease studies is participation. And it would be great to find more communities, more underserved communities that are in need of these statistics, this information, so that we can have more information in these systems. And so surveys like Jenifer's are great, and I'm really glad to see the participation, because it shows that we can actually start addressing these areas of concern. And we can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to close with that. I'm grateful to have been selected this year as the rare voice for COMC. This is just a bonus, but I don't know if anyone has heard or is planning on going, but I will be co-emceeing along the brilliant Noah Choi, hosted by Every Life. So if you guys would like to register, the link is down there. And I just wanted to thank Jenifer again and say that my story is not, it's unique to me, but it's not uncommon. And I fortunately was able to find a 100% match donor through the transplant process, which is very unheard of in my community. I ended up beating the odds, but that doesn't go for all people. So we need increased registration. There's a registration link. I think one of the first slides of my section. So if anyone is interested in registering to donate stem cells, please do that, or send the link to whoever you think would be. But we really need to work on getting these numbers up and helping involve our communities to get more numbers and more statistics that we can use to make the proper change. So thank you, everyone, and I'm going to close out with that.
Thank you, Nate, for sharing your story. I especially like the barbershop story, as it really emphasizes the need for establishing trust as we collect these data and we're delivering quality care in rare disease. We had one question come in from the audience regarding international dissemination of the survey, and I know, Jenifer, you were interested in doing another survey. The person in the audience asked whether the survey included Puerto Rico or other international sites, or whether the next iteration of it might.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. So the National Organization for Rare Disorders has a few organizations as part of the group that is in Puerto Rico. So we did distribute it to other places based on the listserv that we both have. And then for us here at RDDC, we have a few organizations that are US based, but with staff that are in different parts of the world or different parts of US territories. And so if they received our newsletter, it would have gone out to them in that way. I think the map that we shared with you was probably a little bit more intentional as to where some folks with the postcards were sent to, and some of the other things that we could directly say that maybe somebody opened it or somebody was able to make a touch point on there. As opposed to if we just sent it out as a newsletter, we don't necessarily track it back to say that that patient advocacy organization in Puerto Rico did a click-through rate on that in that category. So yes, so there is that opportunity. It's a little hard to do with something internationally based on the questions that we asked, because we were asking about Medicaid and those kinds of things in the US. However, I'm actually taking the show on the road, and so I will be doing this survey information in Belgium next month. So we're sharing this information with other groups so that they can understand a little bit more about some of these populations and some of the pain points that the rare disease community is facing. So not sure about plans about submitting this in 3 to 5 years internationally, but yes, to as soon as next month, this information will be intentionally shared with folks over in Europe.
And another viewer is asking, how can organizations help support RDDC that are part of marginalized, underserved groups?
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone is interested in joining RDDC, feel free to go to our website, and there's a form that you can fill out, and we're happy to have exploratory conversation with you so we can understand what you're working on, and we can share what we're working on to see, and there's, to see if there's a mutual beneficial way of working together, essentially. So that's the best way for us to collaborate.
And we have a few minutes left, so I wanted to try to get a couple questions before we have to end. But I want viewers to know that they can submit questions that we can send on to both you and Nate to answer after the conclusion of the webinar. What key lessons did you learn in creating the survey that would be helpful for others to hear in the patient advocacy or clinical space?
So a couple of, I think, key lessons. When we had first started this, so let me just back up. I started with RDDC in October of 2022. This project was already in place when I started with the organization. And when I looked at the questions, given my background in diversity, equity, and inclusion, I didn't think that the questions either were going to land in the way that I thought that they should land with the underrepresented populations, or they weren't asking the right type of questions in order for us to meet our objectives. So I actually kind of slowed down the train a little bit. That I showed you all that it took us 6 months to get this survey out there, where the group intentionally, I think, thought it would only take them 3 to 4 months. And so again, because of, as patient advocacy organizations, we're made up of volunteers, your timelines are always going to be a little bit longer than what you think. It's kind of like if you ever did construction on a house, they always say save an additional 30% in your budget and also in your timing, because it's going to take a little bit longer. And that was no different in this survey. And as you saw from the numbers, we were doing really well. We were advised that 2,000 would be a good number for respondents. And when we hit the 2,000, but then we looked deeper into the demographics, we weren't reaching the underrepresented population. So we had to keep that open a little bit longer as well. So the whole project, which I think folks maybe originally thought it would take 6 to 9 months, actually took a year. Same thing with getting this report out. As I mentioned, it was finished of June of 2023, but it took us until August of 2024 to actually release the report. When you co-collaborate for a number of different reasons, it takes a little bit longer for everyone just to get on the same page and to come to an agreement to when the report would go out public. So for us, we wanted to get this report out maybe a little earlier, but due to a number of competing priorities on both parties, this report actually did not actually go public until August of 2024. So yeah, that's my, like anyone who's ever done project management or anything along those lines, build in the extra time period, and you know that things are going to take longer. And hopefully for us, at least, it came in within our budget, and hopefully for NORD, it came in with a reasonable budget for them as well.
I think this is a timely topic that a number of different groups are thinking about taking on, and I'm sure you'll hear from those that would like to get involved with RDDC. Dom, I think we're at time. Would you care to close us out and share contact information for viewers to submit further questions should they have them?
Yeah, sure. So if you email, I think we might have it on the next slide, but we'll share the contact information and the video link to our YouTube right after this webinar. And then we are having another webinar in a couple of weeks called Advanced in Vitro Modeling of Neuromuscular Diseases and Therapeutics on November 14th. There's still time to register for that one. And yeah, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our presenters, Jenifer. We really appreciate it. And of course, Nate as well. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.